Okay.
Welcome, everyone, to the third session of the winter series of the Thursday Conversation to End Racism. And happy post-inauguration. Hope you had a good day yesterday. And we have a new administration. So the next time that President Biden has one of the four main pillars or crises that he's going to try to address in his administration right off the bat is what he calls racial equity. And so the next time that you are in a socially distanced elevator wearing your mask, opposite sides of each other, and somebody says, "Hey, what's that all about?" This is what it is from his website. Quote, "The promise of our nation is that every American has an equal chance to get ahead, yet persistent systemic racism and barriers to opportunity have denied this promise for so many. President Biden is putting equity at the center of the agenda with a whole of government approach to embed racial justice across federal agencies, policies, and programs. And President Biden will take action to advance a comprehensive equity agenda to deliver criminal justice reform, end disparities in healthcare access and education, strengthen fair housing, and restore federal respect for tribal sovereignty, among other actions, so that everyone across America has the opportunity to fulfill their potential," end quote. So there you have it. Our work that we're doing here in the conversations that we've been doing for several months now is timely. And so we thank you for your continued support and participation. Backed by popular demand tonight, we have Ms. Samantha Martinez returning from the autumn series, and she is going to speak to us on an important topic that you should have an understanding of what the term means, and that is the term of intersectionality. Intersectionality. And with that, I will just turn it over to Samantha. Welcome back, Samantha.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be back and so excited to see some familiar faces and some new faces as well. As folks have said, my name is Samantha. Y'all can call me Sam. I am a fourth-year graduate student, doctoral student at the University of Oregon. My field of choice is in counseling psychology, and my background is predominantly in working with Latinx youth, but the majority of my experience has worked a span of different identities, from children to adolescents to adults. I've worked with folks with SPMI, severe and persistent mental illness. I've also worked with incarcerated folks, and I've also worked in our hospital system. So a pretty wide variety of folks and presentations and experiences. And I hope to bring some of those experiences in as we talk about this very timely and important topic, which is intersectionality. A few just ground rules / things to make this goes smoothly. Please use the chat, and please feel free to interrupt with any questions. For those of you that were in the autumn series, we had a lot of information jam-packed into the hour and a half, and this one is, well, maybe not lighter. We were able to focus in on one particular concept, and so I'm really hoping for a lighter pace with some spaces for questions and reflections and musings, curiosities, all of those wonderful things. So please feel free to ask questions, whether you pop them in the chat, and Murph, if you wouldn't mind helping me keep an eye on that. And then of course, unmuting and asking questions as we go along. And so without further ado, I will share my screen. And we can go ahead and get started. So first and foremost, welcome. We're going to talk about intersectionality, and we're just going to go ahead and use Intersectionality 101. We're going to call it a journey of self-exploration, because there is so much to be learned on the systemic level and on the ways in which we experience this socially. But before we get to the social component, we also must look within. And so this is going to require a little more introspection, a little more thought around how you exist and move and experience the world. And And so when we start with that, I just want you to keep in mind that there may be a lot of questions that this brings up for you. You may experience conflict, you may experience tension, curiosity, but above all, I hope that you experience hope. And I hope that this gives us an opportunity to move forward and think about the ways in which we move in the world, and then by subsequently the way other folks move in the world and the way that we conceptualize that. So, a quick agenda for our time together today. We're going to start with a theory lesson. We'll talk about what is intersectionality and why should I care? Why should I personally care about it? We'll talk a little bit about the facts and features. So who has talked about intersectionality? Where can I learn more about it? We'll talk about some tips and tricks. When do I use it and how can I use it? And then lastly, we'll engage in some practical exercises. We'll be doing a brief individual reflection. We'll come out and do a pair share, and then we will end with a large group discussion about the different experiences and thoughts that cropped up for us. And if you see me looking off to the side, don't mind me, that's where I have my notes. I'm not staring at my cat, although she is also staring at me. So first and foremost, a theory lesson. What is intersectionality and why should I care? So intersectionality is the encompassing of this image right here. It is an analytical framework for understanding how the aspects of a person's social and political identities combine to create different instances of discrimination and privilege. These social identities are intersecting, they are overlapping, and they can be both empowering and oppressive, often within the same identity. So much of what we will be talking about today is the way in which our identities either create conflict for us in the world, sometimes feel neutral in the world, or sometimes make our world just a little bit easier. And we'll talk about why that is and how those kind of breed into some of these systemic challenges that we experience. Another idea of how we might discuss intersectionality is this. Intersectionality is about fighting discrimination within discrimination, tackling inequalities within inequalities, and protecting minorities within minorities. And this is a perfect idea of intersectionality because it really looks within. It's not a focus on just the external and the things coming from outside that are affecting us, but it also looks at the internal process. What is it that we have incorporated within our own lived experience? What have we been taught? What have we been conditioned to believe and think? And how do those sometimes also create significant damage? How do they eat us from the inside out, so to speak? And this is probably one of my favorite images. This is something that I use when I teach adolescents or when I teach children. Intersectionality as a fun guide is looking at the ways in which the multiplicity of our identity can sometimes have a varying or an echo effect or ripple effect across the water that is our life experience. So in this example, Jess is a triangle who also happens to be striped. She is a stripy red triangle and she should be proud. And here she says, yay me, you go Jess. And sadly, some people don't like Jess, and Jess faces oppression for being a triangle, but she also faces oppression for having stripes. And so here it's hard to read, but she's being made fun of for being an ugly triangle or for having ugly stripes. And luckily, there are liberation groups. There are places where she can feel empowered, but they aren't intersectional. So they look like this. There is a welcome to the triangle group, and there's a welcome to the stripes group. And they don't really talk to each other. And as a matter of fact, they find themselves often in competition with one another. And so you often find these conversations of who's more oppressed, the triangles or the stripes? And what does that look like? And Jess, well, she's both. So she can't really figure out where to go. And so she starts finding herself thinking, am I more of a stripe or am I more of a triangle? Am I more one of these identities or am I more the other? And Jess wishes that the triangles and the stripes could work together because the core belief here is that intersectionality has the core belief that oppressions are interlinked and cannot be solved alone. Therefore, oppressions are not isolated. There is no liberation without equal representation. And oppression of one affects all of us. And that is a concept that we will be engaging in pretty significantly. We'll be talking about how the multiplicity of our identities are actually what creates that empowerment component. It creates that oppressive component, or in most of our experiences, a combination of both. So let's talk about the second piece, these features. Who has talked about it and where can I learn more about it? I'm going to go in pretty deep on the coin person for this particular term, and we'll learn a little bit of history. We'll do a brief timeline of how the term was developed and out of what context. And you also will get a little snapshot into my world as a budding psychologist and the ways in which that we perceive clinical work, the ways in which we engage with clients, but also the ways in which we engage with systems. And that will be important later on as we think about how we ourselves move through those same systems. So me, Kimberly Crenshaw coined the term intersectionality in 1989, which is over 30 years ago, in a paper that was published in the University of Chicago Legal Forum. And it was titled Demarginalizing the Intersection of Race and Sex. And one of the things that I'll include when I send out the slides is I'll include her document and I'll include a couple other documents that I cite in this presentation as well. So for those of you who don't know, Dr. Crenshaw is an American lawyer, civil rights activist. She is a philosopher and a leading scholar of critical race theory, which is going to be really important later on. And she developed the theory of intersectionality. She is currently a full-time professor at UCLA School of Law and also Columbia Law School, which I have a personal affinity for because my partner also goes to Columbia, not the law school though, different school. And she also specializes in race and gender issues. She's also the founder of the Columbia Law School Center for Intersectionality and Social Policy Studies and the African American Policy Forum. And she also happens to be the president of the Berlin-based Center for Intersectional Justice. So my friend here is worldwide, international, and she has all of these fantastic experiences that she uses to inform the work that she does. She's also known for the introduction and the development of intersectionality, the theory of how overlapping or intersecting social identities, particularly minority identities, relate to systems and structures of oppression, domination, and or discrimination. Her scholarship was also fundamental in the development of intersectional feminism, which examines the overlapping systems of oppression and discrimination to which women are subject to due to their ethnicity, sexuality, and economic background. This is an important moment in time also because while we will talk a little bit about how this is maybe Eurocentric, or it'll talk about how we focus primarily on the United States and the minority experience within the United States, much of the thought and much of the theory that is applied here can also be recycled and adjusted for other communities and other environments worldwide. And so we'll talk about that a little less throughout our conversation, but please keep in mind that when we have these discussions, it's primarily with a focus on the US, Canada, and other, I guess you could say, first world countries, although that's not always an accurate statement. So Kimberly's intersectionality looks a little like this. And this is a fun image. It kind of looks, I think, like a tulip. It has this overlapping petals with some individual difference where you can see these little pieces here on the edge, but there's a lot more shared effect. Some things overlap with some things and some things do not. And so you'll notice that this looks very complex. It's beautiful, but complex. And you'll see this reiterated in a lot of different places when we talk about how intersectionality has been extended to be a part of critical race theory, Bronfenbrenner's ecological model, and the addressing model, all of which we'll talk a little bit more about as we move forward. So first and foremost, let's talk about timeline. So as we mentioned, Dr. Crenshaw coined intersectionality in 1989, but as usual, there's usually some stuff that comes before then. So in a nutshell, the 1960s is when the Civil Rights Act is passed in 1965 specifically, and it is mistakenly hailed as just, you know, the end of racism because the kind of concept that it's just a mere multi-century aberration that once corrected through legislative action would no longer impact the law, and it would also not impact the people who rely upon it. Crenshaw vehemently pushed against this and said this is inaccurate. You cannot undo literal centuries of the systemic things that have happened. And so thus began the process of undoing. As she was working on critical race theory at the time, which is another well-known and highly esteemed theory. And for those of you who don't know, I should pause here. Critical race theory is actually a framework in the social sciences that looks primarily at culture and society and how they relate to categorizations of race, law, and power. So those are kind of the pieces that are considered under critical race theory. It began as a movement in American law schools, which of course is Crenshaw's home, in the mid to late 1980s, and it was actually a reworking of critical legal theory on race issues. So just keep that in mind, because it definitely is just these iterations after iteration of new information being integrated into existing policy and knowledge. So in the 1970s, following the Civil Rights Act and the pushback of the Civil Rights Act, the recession of 1970 hit, and in 1976, de Graffenried and General Motors, there was a legal suit where 5 Black women sued General Motors for unfair hiring and firing practices. And so these 5 women argued that the seniority policy targeted Black women exclusively. Basically, the company did not hire Black women before 1964, meaning that when seniority-based layoffs arrived in the early 1970s recession, all Black women hired after 1964 were subsequently laid off, with no concept related to seniority, skill, time spent, none of those things. And the policy didn't just fall under gender or race discrimination. And of course, it needed to be considered as both. However, rather than sue on the basis of each separately, which was considered unworkable, in May of 1976, Judge Harris Wangelin, who was the presiding judge at the time, actually ruled against the 5 Black women, against the plaintiffs, writing in part that Black women would not be considered a separate protected class within the law, or else it would risk opening a, quote, Pandora's box, end quote, of minorities who would demand to be heard in the law. Side note, heaven forbid someone want to be heard on the basis of their identities, but that was the legal precedent for the time. And Crenshaw actually argues in the paper that I'll send for your revision that by treating Black women as purely women or purely Black, the courts, as they did in 1976, have actually repeatedly ignored the specific challenges that face Black women in this group, and thus the onus or the idea, the inkling, the seed for intersectionality was born. And so subsequently in the 1980s, there is the discovery of the racial wealth gap. So an experience that had been well documented and well known by minority communities for literal years, for decades, almost centuries. It's discovered by white academics, and it's discussed, and then it is concluded rather rapidly that there is just no rational explanation for why it exists. And so this is something that occurs in 1982. And then Crenshaw in her article writes that this racial wealth gap persists today, or for minority underrepresentation in spaces, that it's partially due to colorblind standards. So we see the introduction of colorblindness and the importance of having conversations around colorblindness. And I see that we have a chat. I'm going to check it really quick. Is the PowerPoint for sharing use or just access? I would not mind if you shared this. You would be more than welcome to share this. I'll send it as a PDF. Thank you, Sydney. So when we're looking at the way in which this functions, Crenshaw writes that discrimination remains because of the stubborn endurance of the structures of white dominance. And in other words, the American legal and socioeconomic order was largely built on racism or systems of racism. But before the arguments raised by the originators of critical race theory, there actually didn't exist a whole lot of criticism. And so this was pretty new. And then the way that structures of law and society would be intrinsically racist, as opposed to simply distorting racism while otherwise untainted with its stains. So that idea really brought to the fore of this idea that how can we maintain our legal system, our laws, which we thought to be pretty objective, to not have any of these effects on them, and how can we now rework these and understand that they actually have a pretty racist or immovable lens that we need to start working on. So these components are significant significantly important because it brings us now into the 1990s, the concept of intersectionality. So in 1989, Crenshaw publishes her paper, Demarginalizing the Intersection of Race and Sex. And funnily enough, because she's a lawyer and she does lawyer things, the term just kind of stays in the lawyer phase for years, literal years. It just hangs out in this space and no one knows anything of it until 2015. And I'll talk a little bit more about this, but in her paper, Crenshaw first publicly lays out her theory of intersectionality. The paper actually centers 3 legal cases that dealt with issues of both racial discrimination and gender discrimination, which we talked about one already, the one with General Motors. And she argues that the court's narrow view of discrimination was actually a prime example of the ways in which conceptual limitations of single issue analysis regarding the law, how the law considers racism and sexism. And in other words, she accentuates or she posits that the law seems to forget that Black women are both Black and women, which you would think is very basic, but at the time was not, and was not something that was necessarily up for debate, a fantastic standard by our current visualization process. And thus that subject to discrimination on the basis of both race and gender, and often a combination of the two, was a very new concept and one that she was literally laying groundwork for. So now we have all of this 1960 to 1990 concept laid. And so what happens when it just stays in legal land? Well, it stays there. No one knows about it. It's used largely within dockets. It's used largely as a way to maybe push the very fringe or push the envelope of legal cases that are occurring until 2015. Where the term goes mainstream and the community collectively loses its mind because it gets included in the Oxford English Dictionary. And in 2017, the term actually makes its debut at the Women's March. So organizers state that women's intersecting identities meant that they were impacted by a multitude of social justice and human rights issues. Not totally incorrect, but considering that the Women's March largely focused white women, it was an interesting concept and an interesting choice of words for that particular circumstance. Crenshaw, in an article that she did with Vox, actually states this. She compared the experience of seeing other people talking about intersectionality to an out-of-body experience. And she states that sometimes I've read things that say intersectionality, blah, 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 blah. And then I wonder, I wonder whose intersectionality that is, whose definition of intersectionality is that? And then she sees herself cited and she's like, I have never said that. I never wrote that. And that's just not how I think about intersectionality. And what an interesting way to think about the way that the things we write, the things we say, the concepts that we produce can often take on a life of their own, depending on who the person is using it. And she adds, what was puzzling is that usually with ideas that people take seriously, they try to master them, or at least try to read the sources that they are citing for the proposition. And often that doesn't actually happen with intersectionalities. There's a fundamental misunderstanding or a fundamental misapplication of intersectionality. And there are any number of theories as to why that's the case, but what many people have heard or know about intersectionality comes more from what people say than what they've actually encountered themselves. This is going to be central to the way that we talk about intersectionality because there are a lot of conflicts socially and interpersonally around the concept of intersectionality. Those of you who maybe have friends that tend to lean more conservative, or maybe you yourself identify as more conservative, there are a lot of folks that push very hard against the concept of intersectionality, not because of what the definition is, but because of the misapplication. And we'll talk about this under the coverage of the term, the conflict, a little bit later in the conversation. I'm going to take a quick second just to check the chat. What about the 2015 term, 2015 that the term exploded? This was thought to be in part because of youth that had gotten a hold of the term and started applying it in college settings, but also with the prevalence of Facebook and Instagram and other social media usage, the transition from different things like Snapchat or from Facebook to Instagram and Twitter. Twitter's a big one. The use of this language actually became more accessible. So scholars that had been using this language for such a long time were able to put that on a media front, and then from there it caught like wildfire. 2015, for some reason, was the year that this happened. So let's talk about the conflict. I said we'd talk about it, and so now we're going to talk about it. So intersectionality as a curse word. This was probably my favorite part of developing this presentation. So there is a pretty strong resistance to intersectionality from what is quoted as the conservative right. I don't know, I can't verify for sure if it's the conservative right or not, but just a general reluctance and resistance. And they state, they meaning the people that were interviewed, the people that have largely expressed concern with this term, that it's not about the theory, it's about the implication, or it's about the application in many circumstances. And so on the right, intersectionality, the best that I can understand it, can be described as a new caste system, placing non-white, non-heterosexual people at the top. And so many folks have experienced this as what they might call a victim mentality. And so that's something that has come to the fore pretty consistently, because folks feel like it's almost an oppression Olympics. That's the other term that I hear really consistently when discussing intersectionality. They tend to feel like when you're a minority, it must mean that you're asking for special standards, special treatment, or maybe it even promotes solipsism at the personal level and division at the social level. It can also, for some folks, represent a form of feminism that puts a label on you and kind of expects you to act out how oppressed you are. It tells you what you're allowed to say, what you're allowed to think, and some folks have gone as far as to categorize it as really dangerous and suggest that it is a conspiracy theory for victimization. So a conspiracy theory of victimization. And so this very interesting, very highly unusual disdain for this word that kind of resided quietly in the legal system until relatively recently, at least the past, 6 years now, is how recently it's been in the front of our faces, more colloquially. But in conversations with a lot of the right-wing critics of intersectionality, as we've talked about, it's interesting to note that what upsets them isn't the definition, it isn't the theory itself. Actually, they largely agree that it's important to consider the ways in which people's differing identities impact the way that they perceive and experience the world. And while that is the core of intersectionality, and while it's funny to note that we are all in agreement that that's what the definition is and that's where it should kind of stay, we would be remiss to not consider the larger perspective or the larger pushback, reluctance, and resistance we see to the term, because as we know, sometimes vocabulary alone, sometimes language alone is the thing that can shut down conversations between friends, between colleagues, between peers, between loved ones. And so when we talk about things as volatile as intersectionality, as truly challenging as intersectionality, it's important to set some ground understanding, some basic fundamental understandings. What do you think intersectionality is? What does it mean when I say that to you? How do you respond to it? And so in this particular circumstances, we think of lived experience and the experience of discrimination, of how a person of color lives a life that is often very different from a person who identifies as white. And then often the objection comes to the implication, uses, and maybe more importantly, the consequences of upending racial and cultural hierarchies to create a new one. This is where I perhaps struggle a little bit more as we talk about the challenges associated with intersectionality. Intersectionality does not fundamentally suggest that you upend racial and cultural hierarchy with the intention of establishing a new one. It is the intention of upending racial and cultural hierarchy, full stop. the hope is to ameliorate the hierarchy. The hope is to reduce it to such an extent that it no longer exists, or it is considered an old concept that no longer is necessary. The establishment of a new one comes from an existing fear of just flipping the script, so to speak, so that people that existed at the bottom are now at the top, and people that were at the top are now on the bottom. And so I say this with the intention of kind of drawing out the conflict there, of saying that this is not with the intention of putting people who currently are, let's say, at the top, which would be cis, heterosexual, white men, all of those things. It's not with the intention of putting them at the bottom. It's with the intention of ameliorating the hierarchy that put them at the top in the first place. And so it's a move to the middle, as opposed to a move to polarized sides. And so that's something that's often difficult for a lot of folks to grasp. And so I just want to state that outwardly, because it'll be important in the way that we perceive our identities as well. And so as we move to this idea of utilization, this is where it starts to get a little fun, because this is where the you starts to come in. This is where we as human beings become central in the movement. And it also is where we become central in the way that we perceive ourselves. I'm going to take a brief pause there and ask if there are any questions that are coming up. I see we have one chat. Flipping the script as part of the gospel, not social science. That's interesting. Martin, will you say a little bit more about flipping the script as part of gospel?
I'm not a good enough biblical scholar to tell you chapter and verse, but there's a strong message: the last shall be first, and the first shall be last. So in terms of the hierarchies, there's a strong gospel message that the current hierarchy established by monetarized wealth and scarcity is inconsistent with gospel values and what Christ came to this world to try to turn around.
Yeah, I really appreciate you bringing that in, because that's part of the nuance that often gets implicated or utilized as a way to say, why should we mess with this structure? There's a lot of religious connotation and a religious value, or I might even say religious justification assigned to the idea of flipping a script. And many folks that express contention or express concern with the idea of flipping a script often cite biblical value, and they'll say this is the system for a reason. Who are we to upset a system that is reinforced by God himself? And that's an interesting concept as well, because in many circumstances, scripture also looks at loving one another as equals, or the value of egalitarianism, the value of sharing the space together. And when we look at the ways in which religion and social science intervene, it's often the case that we care so deeply for one another, that the goal is to care so deeply for one another, that it is not our responsibility to establish those hierarchies amongst ourselves, that those hierarchies exist to be determined by someone else, a higher power, God himself. And so that idea, yes, Greg, I love the way that you place that, the idea of threatening folks, that folks feel perturbed, they feel uncomfortable with the ways that things are shifting. And sometimes that lacks the foresight of recognizing that things are intended to shift. The only thing that is certain is change. And because we know that change is pivotal to the way that we move forward, integrating this idea of change and integrating this idea of incorporation is actually much more fundamental to our continuation than we might expect otherwise. Yeah, pivotal, because, yep, marriage equality, that was definitely one of the things that popped up for that circumstance. And intersectionality was included in like LGBTQ rights and other like queer identified movements long before it was included in other types of movements. So it usually has the parallel process, right, of there being the ethnicity, race and ethnicity, LGBTQ, sexual orientation and identity. All of those things were happening kind of one right after the other. And in many ways, it was an interesting time to be alive, to have all of those things happening at the same time. And in many ways, I wonder if it didn't feel like it was changing too fast for folks. There wasn't much time to catch your breath in between all of the new things that were coming up. Great points, y'all. Great conversation. So moving into tips, I'm going to offer a couple of different frameworks. We've talked about intersectionality, we've talked about the concepts behind it, and we've talked a little bit about the intention of intersectionality, what it is intended to do. Now I'm going to give you some basic skills. When you hear the words framework and model, many of these are coming from my own education and my own, very social specific education, counseling psychology specific education. And I want to name that up front because it is quite literally my job to consider the multiplicity of ways in which people's identities either help or hinder the way they move throughout the world. And so you will see models that I utilize here with that in mind. And I'll encourage you to use some of these models in some of the activities that we accomplish together. So the first thing that I want to teach is Pamela Hayes' 1996 and then updated again in 2008, the addressing model, which is used as a framework to reflect sociocultural identity and diversity. And it's also to take a step towards understanding those nuances of cultural identity. So addressing stands for the following: age and generation, developmental disability, acquired disability, religion, ethnicity and race, socioeconomic status, sexual orientation, Indigenous group membership, national origin and language, and gender identity. These are, while not an exhaustive list, are thought to incorporate much of the key players in nuance for somebody's identity. And lest anyone believe that each of these is as simple as saying, yes, this is the privileged identity and this is the oppressed identity. If only it were that easy. Each of these components has within it a complex system of the way that we perceive the different identities that people are assigned. So for example, with age and generation, that's a personal favorite of mine. When we're working with age and generation, there are circumstances in which the older you are, the more wisdom you are assigned, the more life experience you are assigned, and the more just general appreciation and that you are an elder, you have this experience, and you de facto should be respected, and your perception often matters more than that of a young person. Now, we also consider the workplace in which folks that are older are often feeling as though they are discriminated against because they don't have experience with more recent technology. They maybe are less comfortable with systems like social media, or maybe if it's a job that requires a lot of physical engagement, their bodies are not as limber as they used to be and thus may suffer more injury more rapidly. And so this is a perfect example of how age and generation, while there is a widespread listing of like age and how age affects you and how generation affects you, the context really does matter. And the context in which you exist and engage on a daily basis will dictate the way that you experience whether your age is an oppressive factor or an empowering factor. So that's something to keep in mind as well as we move through some of these different identities. I will also say that each factor helps researchers, clinicians, lawyers, doctors, all of the people, and now you, understand the way underrepresented groups and oppressive forces affect not only yourself, but the community at large. I will also say that the purpose, this is another article that I will share with you. It's her 1998 iteration, but this model is intended to describe the organizing and systemically considering these complex cultural influences. I work with it primarily as a therapist. So whenever I do intakes, I ask questions to these effects, like how has your age kind of contributed to the presenting issue that you're coming in today with? Are there any disabilities that you were born with versus disabilities that you acquired later in life? You'll notice that this is particularly relevant for folks who maybe had the use of their sight when they were younger and has experienced the world versus someone who was born without sight and has never experienced the world with sight. So these are important distinctions because it speaks to a person's sense of loss or sense of gain, depending on the context in which they exist. I think that this is another moment I just want to re-emphasize that these examples refer primarily to US minority groups, but it is applicable to multicultural societies in Canada and Australia, but again, an emphasis on Anglo-European culture. Carol, I love this. So tired of hierarchies. I'm there with you, girl. How does our discussion relate to what some people call you win, I lose, or the zero-sum game? I love this question. This is what I like to call the pie question, because there's only so much pie, right? I think that what this looks like is, we'll talk about this in the context of Oppression Olympics, but the zero-sum game essentially assumes that there's only so much oppression to go around and that everyone needs to snap up their own little slice of oppression. And this is one of my favorite comments because of the fact that it tends to this idea of how do I weaponize or otherwise make effective my victimhood? And this is something that I will talk about. So Carol, hold on to that question because we'll definitely get to it because I love that question and I want to talk about it more. Moving to so this is the addressing framework. Remember this, we're gonna come back to it, we're gonna utilize it. I'm gonna introduce you to another framework that I actually use more in the context of my intakes and actually my client conceptualizations, but it is essentially the marriage of the addressing framework and also of intersectionality. So this is the Bronfenbrenner ecological model. And so this is one of my favorite ones, not only because it's the one that I'm trained the best in, but it actually was coming out around the same time that intersectionality was, and also critical race theory. And so it's a framework through which community psychologists, and community as opposed to like in the systems, or like if we look at hierarchy talk, people who work primarily in academia, this is people who are out in the community working with community members and had a better sense of what was going on in a layperson's existence, not just what was happening in, the ivory tower of academia. This is the process through which community psychologists examine individuals' relationships within families, within communities, and then within the larger society. So if you remember what we talked about with intersectionality and Crenshaw's intersectionality, that beautiful tulip, this is much less beautiful, but it's the idea of concentric circles. So this idea of a bullseye, right? You have the child or the individual, it doesn't need to be a child, but the individual here, and the addressing model, all of those things, all of those components would go into this little orange circle here. Those are all of the individual identities affecting that person. And then outside of that, you have the microsystem, the immediate environment. This is the home. This is the relationship with parents. This is the relationship with siblings. If you have a multi-generational household, maybe relationship with grandma, cousins, aunties, uncles, all of those good things. Whatever's happening in the home is the microsystem. Moving to the mesosystem, you have connections. These are the things that facilitate whether or not the home space is comfortable because it has the larger systemic effects. So you're looking at things like parents' jobs. If they have a really positive work environment, maybe they come home happy, maybe they're comfortable, maybe they sit down to dinner because it's a 9-to-5 job and they get to spend some time with their families. Or maybe they work nights, or maybe the job is painful. Maybe the job is rough. Maybe they come home and they are distressed. Maybe it's a job that drives them to become substance dependent and they start to use more substances like alcohol. Maybe there is instances of abuse in the household because of the stress provided by a work environment. The mesosystem speaks to the ways in which those connections are facilitated. The exosystem are things like indirect environment. So these are the workplaces themselves and the cultures in that workplace. Is that a workplace that values diversity? And are you a person of color and you feel undervalued in that environment? Is that a place where the assumption is that everyone is able-bodied, able to hear, able to walk, able to move? Or is that a place that constantly challenges your ability to keep up with everybody else, even though you're consistently in pain? Maybe you're chronically ill. Maybe you chronically have difficulty in that system. Moving on to the purple, the macro system, social and cultural values. What kind of system or society are you existing in? Are you in a system like me as someone who comes from a Latinx community? Are you collectivistic? Is it kind of all for one and one for all? Are we working on this concept of working together and as a village we are raising these children? Or is it more individualistic? Is there an emphasis on you mind your business, I'll mind mine? Is it you focus on the benefit of your life and you do what you need to take care of, and I will only get involved if I'm asked to or if it's completely necessary? These social and cultural values have a significant effect on the way that we as families and communities interact with one another. And then lastly, but certainly not least, is the chronosystem. And this is the way that things change over time. So all of us can think of some pretty easy examples. For example, the Civil Rights Act, when people became able to vote. And then what happened after that? There were folks that were like, oh yeah, great, now everybody can vote. Cool beans. And some folks were like, this is like the audacity of these people feeling like they could have the right to vote when, they're no better than, insert kind of slur here. So this is important because the shift over time, how quickly a community adapts, integrates, and encompasses new values, dictates whether or not there are long-lasting sentiments, pains, and other oppressive forces. So Bronfenbrenner does a really good job of integrating a lot of different pieces into a pretty, what I would say, uncomplicated model, even though in talking about it, there's some complexity engaged within it. I will also say that if you look up ecological systems theory, you'll also see development in context or human ecology theory. Those are the other two names that it goes by. And this is a way in which it focuses on cyclical relationships between the social and the individual addressing values, because society dictates the privilege or oppression of each compounding identity. And the reason why this is important is because as you look at the smallest child or individual circle, whatever exists within that circle, all of the addressing level identities within that circle, whether or not they are perceived as empowering or as oppressive is almost entirely contextually dependent on what's going on in this ecological systems theory. If you have a community that is really positive and queer positive, LGBTQ positive, and you have a child that identifies as LGBTQ, that child's identity as LGBTQ will be considered one of empowerment, of privilege, not one of oppression. But if you take that same child and you put them in a system that is very, maybe the word Puritan comes to mind here, or one that doesn't have a positive value around queerness and queer identity, that same child is going to struggle. And that same identity that was such an empowering concept and experience and identity before is now something that feels shameful, something that they want to hide, and something that they don't want to engage in the larger system. So that's something that I definitely want folks to have in the back of their minds as we're thinking about these concentric circles. So now we're going to get to Carol's question. So let's talk a little bit about compounding effects and context. So what this means is that the higher number of marginalized identities of the individual, the higher likelihood of experiencing identity-based oppression. That's what this is talking about. And the reason why I don't say that the higher number of marginalized identities, the higher rates of oppression, even though that's technically true, that's not a one-to-one correlation. It's a correlation, not causation, so to speak. So just because someone has a marginalized identity doesn't mean de facto that they are going to experience identity-based oppression. And an example of that, that one that I can speak to personally, is this idea of passing. So as I've said before, I identify as Latina. Both of my parents are immigrants from Mexico. However, because I was born in the United States, because I don't speak with accented English, often I don't receive the experiences of identity-based oppression because I speak with unaccented English, because I am light enough to pass as white if I chose to do so, because my features are general enough, that androgynous enough, that they have no concern about whether or not I am what I say I am. There's no questioning about this. If I wanted to not share my Latinx identity, no one would think twice about it. And so that's an important concept, because the flip side of this is that if we were to assume that any marginalized identity carried by any individual fundamentally equaled oppression, we would actually be making a lot of error, and we would be making a lot of assumptions and a lot of mistaken assumptions about people's identities. Other examples of this are colorism, whether or not there is prejudice and discrimination within a community of color, social capital, whether or not people have access, or even just experiential family members that have access. And then also education. Access to education is a good example to this. And then also whether or not someone utilizes the tool of education and how that works at those systemic levels as well. And then moving more to Carol's point here, this isn't about the oppression Olympics. It's not about who has it worse, though that should be part of the conversation. The most marginalized compounded identities should be something that we consider. But this history of weaponization and cultural appropriation, when it comes to identity, oppressed identities, it's when it becomes fashionable. And I want to use that word very intentionally. Ever since 2015 and kind of the word coming to the forefront, we've also seen a number of instances in which cultural appropriation starts to exist, of someone saying, oh, what's a good example of this? Oh yeah, my personal favorite is when people say, oh yes, I'm like 1/38 indigenous. And because of that, I embrace all of the sorrows and all of the difficulties and all of the lived experiences of this indigenous community, even though that person was not raised in the environment, has never had those particular experiences, but speaks as though they were a personal recipient of those oppression experiences or of those traumas. In many ways, that is when an oppressed identity has become fashionable, and it becomes utilized, it becomes weaponized as a way to purport or to push forward ideas that are actually completely incongruent with the concepts and the ideas of the group themselves. So in this context, Carol, the you win, I lose, the zero-sum game, that's the oppression Olympics game. That's the way of saying that because I have this oppressed identity, I have it worse, and because I have it worse, my opinion is somehow elevated in some way. Opinions of folks that have oppressed identities should be paid attention to, should be listened to, and should be put at the forefront of movements that we're discussing in terms of how to benefit the community. It doesn't mean that opinions of oppressed peoples and people with those oppressed identities should not be criticized. In many ways, some of you it'll be reminiscent of Baldwin, right, who speaks of his love for America, but also posits that if he is unable to criticize that which he loves, America, then that is not a relationship that he wants to maintain. Because in order to maintain a positive relationship, and in order for something to grow, there has to be critical analysis. There has to be critical engagement with that same concept. Having the identity alone does not make you someone who is going to be the be-all, end-all of that particular identity. So that's a lot to kind of go off of in this particular moment. I want to take a brief pause before we jump into the next component, which will be our practical exercises, and open some time for questions. What questions do you have about these concepts? What questions do you have about the application?
Sydney Fitzpatrick, would you repeat your comment that you put in the chat box? Unmute yourself and...
Sure. Okay. What I said was that the conversation in the law, because I went to law school in the early 90s, starting 89 to 92. And during my law school years, it was the first time the courts recognized a reasonable woman versus a reasonable man standard. And that started a lot of conversation within the legal community, not that it played out necessarily in the courts. And then I stopped doing employment law, which is where you really see this. It's the only place that has actually been applied to date. I was talking about how intersectionality should also be recognized too. That a reasonable man and a reasonable woman standard in the law in the US really means the white person. Mm-hmm. And so there's so much, it's so deep and wide, but I just wanted to make the point that those conversations did start for law wonks like myself back, almost, 25 years ago. But the implementation, what does that look like then? Then does that mean for a woman plaintiff, does the jury have to be all female? And questions like that that are so deep and wide and difficult within the implementation concept, which I think has an application in the wider society too. How do you do this? So I just wanted to make that comment, just because it's always been really close to my heart, those inequities within our system, because most of my practice, well, part that I loved was in civil rights. So
Thank you, Sydney.
just saying that.
Comments?
Sydney or Samantha, I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about Senator Elizabeth Warren's disclosure a couple of years ago that she had Native American blood, and President Trump, his response in calling her, what was it, Sacagawea or something, as
Pocahontas.
Pocahontas, that's right. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, most of them probably not good for polite company, but I will say that in many ways, the idea of oppression Olympics has pervaded a lot of positive spaces, a lot of positive conversations. And one of the things that I think the conservative right, as we talked about earlier, the conflict to which they're speaking of is exactly this, where folks feel like they have the only way in which they gain legitimacy is to own an oppressive identity or an oppressed identity that they actually may not have, or that they may have but have had no interface with. And that is the danger of playing oppression Olympics. Oppression Olympics should not be, well, it shouldn't be the way that we manage the things, but it especially becomes harmful because people should be able to speak on their experience in their own right. And that becomes incredibly valuable because my value, or what I bring to the table as a cis-het woman of color who has an education, who has this particular experience, should not be undervalued because I'm passing, but it should be looked at through a critical lens because I can pass. The fact that my lived experience is not difficult in the same way that someone with a darker coloration or with accented English, the way that my existence is not complicated by that, the feedback that I give, the lived experience that I share should have that critical note attached to it. It is my responsibility as someone who doesn't have those lived difficulties to acknowledge and respect that for those that do. And I think that that's where oppression Olympics takes away our capacity to interface with one another. It takes away our capacity to step away from the defensiveness, step away from the experience of like, oh yeah, you're right. That is a way in which I have not suffered. And another way to put that is we shouldn't be fighting over who suffered more. It's not a badge of honor to have suffered more. It's painful. Suffering is not something that we should be saying, oh yeah, I'm the best because I've had to live through so much, ungodly crap. It's more saying that I have survived this and I have the experience of someone who has survived this. And so again, it's a step away from victimhood and a step towards autonomy and an existence of moving forward and of survivorhood, not of victimhood, but of survivorhood. And so to your point, Father Fred, about this, about Dr. of Elizabeth Warren, I would not be surprised if her disclosure had something to do with her wanting to have legitimacy. I would not be surprised if the reason for her disclosure was to say, yes, I have the right to say this because of this identity that I hold. And the mistake that was made is that she should have never been asked to utilize that to legitimize her statements. She should have been legitimized on the basis of her experiences alone. And I think that that's where we start to see some of the conflicts that arise.
Thank you, Samantha.
Mm-hmm. And I think to your point too, Sydney, I was looking at your comment, and I think about implementation, and that is the hardest way to start conceptualizing it. And something I said earlier, I want to make sure that I speak to that very clearly. Having a seat at the table is great. but wanting to make sure that your voices are heard and feeling invited in that space is better. So having a seat at the table is ideal, making sure that our juries, making sure that our laws, making sure that all the many ways in which white supremacy and whiteness has maybe to some extent been the only story that has existed. I think about like histories of medication and how, you know, medications are normed on, you know, white men typically, those types of things. When we start introducing new stories, when we start introducing new identities and new experiences, that de facto will follow, because we will have.
I want to just add something to that too, because I think it's a matter of education about other voices and allowing them to be heard. I wanted to share with you a comment. A Black woman professor who was a guest professor when I worked at the law school, after law school, said something that was so profound for me. She said that women lawyers try to pass for men the way that Blacks tried to pass for white in the South. And it was, the concept is that we tried to adopt what was identified as male professionalism, which took away our voice in the law. And until women and people of color and LGBTQI, et cetera, can find their own voices at the table, whether it's in the law or otherwise medicine or whatever, then giving up our identity to try to be the cis white man is not healthy for our culture, for us, for anyone. It is an abdication of everything that makes us great. So I just offer that. I thought it was a very good example.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you for sharing that. And that's absolutely right on par with what we're talking about here, that none of us should be aspiring to be something that we're not. We should all be able to utilize the individual skills that we bring to the table and make more capable, make more augmented, make more nuanced the spaces that we already occupy, because there's richness and difference. Yeah, Greg, making sure that everything we do is intersectional, and even that can even be the way that we address and experience conflict, right? The way that we disagree with folks. One of the biggest criticisms I have about my field in counseling psychology, like, we're therapists. We literally teach people some of these skills, and the field is so conflict averse. Like, they do not like to confront things that are challenging, and it's laughable in a lot of ways, because how can you teach clients these skills to confront and self-advocate and push forward for themselves, and then when you find yourself in the field, the threat of licensure looms so heavy over your heads that you're unwilling to speak out in the way that you see as necessary. So conflict avoidance is not going to be helpful in these difficult conversations. Awesome. Great conversations, y'all. Any other thoughts before we move on? Yeah, unity. Yeah, instead of making it on your own. Absolutely, Carol. Focus on community, and a reminder that my alma mater is actually Willamette University. I went there for my undergraduate education, and their motto is "Not unto ourselves alone are we born." And that just makes me think of that instantly, that this is about the unity of us together and being able to build each other up together, even when we disagree. Excellent. I'm keeping an eye on the time, and I want to make sure that we have some time for our activity. So I'm going to move us into our final phase. Yeah, yes, Willamette is so white. It was also, their law school was also incredibly white. So I'm going to bop us right into the next section, which is our practical exercises. So first and foremost, I'd like to encourage a 10-minute reflection. So we're at 6:07 now. And so what I'd like to do is I'm going to shorten this to 5 minutes. So I'm going to give us until 6:15, and then I'm going to put us into pairs. But what I'd like you to do is reflect on your identities, both visible and invisible, and notice how they've shaped your character, your identity, and your experience of the world. So using the addressing model components, I want you to list your identities as they assign to each of those. And you can do now if that feels comfortable for you, or you can think of a moment where some of these things were more salient. Some folks like to think about a time when they were children and how that particular moment affected them. Some like to think of adolescence or early adulthood. Whatever feels comfortable for you, feel free to utilize that. List your identities and see if you can identify instances of privilege or lack thereof associated with each. And just as a reminder, just because you're part of a privileged class in one identity doesn't mean you will be across identities. And feel free to include any identities you think are not included or accounted for by the addressing model. So I will set a timer. It'll be very loud and it'll echo across the computer when folks are done. And I will bring us back in 5 minutes so that way we can have a brief conversation about it afterwards. So we're going to get started in 3, 2, 1, start.
Carol would like you to put up the model, please.
Yes. Which model? The Bronfenbrenner model?
Yeah, Carol, which one? Or the addressing model?
Oh yeah, it's right here under reflect.
Right here.
Is that the one you meant, Carol?
Let me see. Yeah, Carol, do you see this right model here, the addressing model? Okay, got it. Okay.
Perfect.
Yep. Just zoom up on your display.
Probably do. There we go. That might be easier.
There you go. Thanks, Sam.
Mm-hmm.
This is so interesting, Sam, because I can see where this all adjusts itself. It's very fluid during a lifespan, isn't it? Yeah, it's interesting.
Absolutely. One of the benefits of the model is that it changes as we do.
Hmm. How would you define developmental disability? Is it what I think it is?
Yeah, developmental disability tends to speak to things that are from birth in many circumstances, or developed over the course of time because of a genetic condition or a genetic context. Whereas an acquired disability usually looks at stuff like, oh, it could be anything from difficulty with your eyes. If you've had difficulty with your eyes and have needed glasses, that's a developed disability. Or it could also be something where you've experienced an accident, and because of that, you are now in a different circumstance. You have different use of your limbs and your body or your brain.
Okay.
I'll add, when I was a special education teacher for many years, developmental disability was used as a newer term for mental retardation for a while, because it included spina bifida and mental retardation and birth defects and all kinds of other things, cerebral palsy, etc. But if I were born blind, if I were born deaf, versus I went blind at 6 or I went deaf at 70, you know, developmental means from birth or in the early years of development.
Thanks, Carol.
Thanks, Carol. Y'all got just about a minute left on the clock. All right, and stop. So finish writing down your last thoughts and bring your attention back to the screen. And so now what I'd like to do is it'll be kind of a quick turnaround, but I'd like to give us 6 minutes in pair share. And what I'd like you to do is 3 minutes apiece. And I'd like you to go through the addressing model. And as you are comfortable, just state your identity in each one of those. Sometimes there is significant power in just being able to name what each of your identities is in this circumstance. And if you have time in those 3 minutes, feel free to talk about any of these 3 questions. What surprised you about your identities and privilege or oppression experiences? Where do you experience the most tension or discomfort? And what, if anything, do you disagree with? Is there anything there that feels uncomfortable where you're like, no, that doesn't feel like a privilege or that doesn't feel like an oppressive identity? Any and all experiences are valid and welcome for this space. So Murph, if you wouldn't mind just bopping them out for 6 minutes.
Okay, everybody, I'm going to open up rooms and please go to your assigned room.